I suggested that in preparation for this, you do some listening, and if possible, to listen to one of the performances on period instruments. I believe you'll agree with me that the sound is somewhat different. I haven't gone into that at great length. And you'd think, well, a violin's a violin, right? Mr. Stradivarius made violins before Beethoven was born. Violins haven't changed because Isaac Stern goes out and plays a Stradivarius violin to this very day. What we don't realize is that when Mr. Stradivarius made the violin, it was meant to play at a certain kind of pitch, a certain kind of music in a certain sort of room. And it had gut strings on it and a sort of shorter, lighter bow that made a different kind of sound with real clear beginnings and ends of notes and things like that. You might say it had a lot more consonant with respect to its vowels than modern violin players do. In the course of the 19th century, beginning at about the time of Beethoven, people began to want to play concerts because people wanted to hear concerts for large audiences. Think, most audiences had been small before. Now, anybody who could buy a ticket could go and hear a symphony. It used to be you had to be a member of the Esterházy family or their friend. So we get bigger and bigger concert halls. We need more and more sound to fill them up. We want the violin to play louder. So we get a bigger bow. Mr. Tourt invents a big bow with a lot more hair on it. We put a lot more pressure on the violin. We decide that if the pitch were higher, that would be good. So we turn the violin up higher. We put more tension on the strings. That puts pressure on the violin, and if you don't watch out, it'll collapse. Then we decide that we all want to play like Paganini, so that instead of just playing this high on the violin, we want to play way up to a high Q, up higher than the fingerboard is. So what do? We take the neck off, we make a longer neck and a longer fingerboard, and put it back on the violin, but we still screw it up to the same pitch. And then by the time we get to the early 20th century, we decided we should have metal strings. Wire strings can be much louder. And the pitch still goes up higher, so now we're playing at A440 or even higher. Mr. Stern's violin has been taken completely apart. It's had more reinforcement put inside. A longer neck has been put on. The neck has been set at a different angle. A longer fingerboard's been put on. It's been put under enormously more tension than Mr. Stradivarius ever intended. Has these big wire strings and a great big bow. And he plays it with a chin rest like that so that he can run up and down on the fingerboard. And he plays the Tchaikovsky Violin Concerto to 5,000 people. You tell me that's the same instrument that Beethoven's players were playing on. The box is the same, but the instrument's completely different. The horns, we talked a little bit about the horns and the trumpets. This is just the beginning of all the technology that makes for all those wonderful key systems and valve systems and things that will soon be all over all of the wind instruments. But not yet. So the instruments were, in a way, somehow more intimate, but more articulate than the instruments of today, even though they look sort of alike. We talked about the fact that stringed instruments probably did not use vibrato all the time. And I think when you put all of those features together, the fact is that Beethoven's orchestra, played by people who played in the styles of Beethoven's contemporaries, will have sounded quite different from a modern orchestra to people whose hearing is well enough refined to be able to make distinctions of that kind. And since my interest, and I presume yours because you came, is partly in what differences are there between what it sounded like in 1824 and what it sounds like now? The physical, acoustical differences are really measurable, and for my money, make a difference in the way the music sounds, and I hope for you to have something of that experience. That was the reason. So I'm an early instruments man. I'm for it. I am not for preaching to everybody and saying this is how you must do anything. But I am very happy that there are people in the world who want to take Beethoven seriously to the extent of saying, I wonder what it sounded like. And it turns out that you, from playing on an old instrument, you learn some things that seem crazy. All of those chords in Beethoven piano sonatas that go like this, you know, all those really big chords down on the bottom of the piano. But there are all these chords, all dark and way too close together and sound awful on the big black Steinway. Play them on Beethoven's piano that gets a little bit weaker in the bottom, and it turns out that he writes his piano sonatas perfectly for his instrument. And it may be that he would have liked the big black Steinway if he'd had one, but he would not have written those piano sonatas for it. So I think we learn a lot from the instruments and from the performing styles of the time, which we can then adopt as our regular performing style, or we can say that's really interesting. That was then, this is now. I don't want to say everybody must do things in one particular way, but I am delighted that somebody has built a Shakespearean theater in London and people are trying to put on plays that look the way they did to Shakespeare's playgoers, because we need to know about that so that we can make well-informed decisions about what we do, and so that we can learn what there is in performances that is a localized convention. Certain things we assume about how a concert is supposed to work, as we know, are recent developments. Not clapping between movements, dressing up in tails, certain kinds of the way the orchestra itself works and is seated and behaves. Recent developments. It didn't work that way in 1824, but if we're not careful, we can think this is the way it is, the way it always has been, and the way it must be. And one of the things about studying other possibilities is that the choices you make are well-informed choices from the whole smorgasbord of possibilities.